You've been lied to about who really built America. Everything you learned in school about brave knights, powerful lords, and grand adventures. That's Europe's story, not ours. And the women who shaped this land have been erased from history while men took all the credit. Let me tell you something that'll make your blood boil. When we talk about medieval America, we're actually talking about the centuries before Europeans arrived, roughly from the year 500 to 1500. During this time, while European women were locked in towers and treated like property, Indigenous women in America were leading armies, choosing chiefs, and literally controlling whether their nations went to war or made peace. Yes, you heard that right. Women had the power to veto war. Try finding that in medieval Europe. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. These women weren't just sitting around weaving baskets and cooking meals, although, let me be clear, those skills kept entire civilizations alive, and that's no small thing. No, these women were architects, farmers, spiritual leaders, diplomats, and the ultimate decision makers in ways that would make modern politicians jealous. They built societies so advanced that when European men finally showed up, they couldn't wrap their heads around what they were seeing. Picture this scene for a moment. A Haudenosaunee Clan Mother sits in council, surrounded by male chiefs who wait respectfully for her words. She's just returned from inspecting the season's crops, consulting with the medicine women, and meeting with mothers throughout the community. Now she rises to speak, and when she does, she holds the power to remove any chief who isn't serving the people properly. One word from her, and a leader loses his position. No elections, no debates, just her decision based on what's best for the community. The men in that room know something that Europeans refused to understand for centuries. Real power doesn't come from swords or crowns. It comes from the trust of the people who feed you, raise you, and ultimately decide if you deserve to lead them. Let's start with something mind-blowing that nobody talks about. The Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Haudenosaunee, had a political system so sophisticated that it influenced the American Constitution. But guess who was really running things? Women. The Clan Mothers held power that European queens could only dream about. These women selected the chiefs, advised on all major decisions, and could remove leaders who didn't serve the people well. Imagine telling a medieval European king that a group of women could just fire him. He'd probably faint from shock. But it wasn't just political power. Haudenosaunee women owned the Longhouses where families lived. They owned the land they farmed. They owned the crops they grew. When a man married, he moved into his wife's longhouse and became part of her clan. Children belonged to the mother's clan, not the father's. Property passed from mother to daughter. If there was a divorce, and yes, women could initiate divorce whenever they wanted, the man packed his bags and left. He went back to his mother's or sister's longhouse. The woman kept everything, including the children, the house, and the fields. Now, before you think this was just one unique group, let me blow your mind again. This pattern existed across huge portions of North America. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples, often called the 5 civilized tribes, all had matrilineal systems. Women controlled domestic life, agriculture, and had significant voices in community decisions. Cherokee women in particular were known as war women or beloved women, titles earned through wisdom, bravery, or exceptional service to the community. These women could spare the lives of captives, had full voting rights in councils, and one beloved woman named Nancy Ward became so influential that she negotiated with the United States government as an equal. Let me paint you another picture, because this is where it gets really emotional. Imagine being a Cherokee girl growing up in the year 1200. You wake up in your mother's home, surrounded by your sisters, aunts, and grandmother. Your father lives there too, but he came from another clan when he married your mother. You know that when you grow up, you'll inherit this house and the fields your mother tends. You watch your grandmother sit in council meetings, her opinion valued as much as any man's. You see your aunt, a war woman, return from a diplomatic mission where she helped negotiate peace with a neighboring tribe. You understand, deep in your bones, that being female doesn't limit you. Your society has a place for your voice, your work, your leadership. Now contrast that with a girl in medieval Europe at the same time. She's property. First her father's, then her husband's. She can't own land. She can't choose her spouse. Her main value is producing sons and maybe bringing a good dowry. If she's lucky and born into nobility, she might get some education. If she's a peasant, which most people were, she'll work herself to death and die young, and history won't even record her name. The difference is staggering. And here's what makes me angry. We erased this history. We let people believe that women's liberation is a modern Western invention when Indigenous women in America had rights and respect that European women wouldn't see for hundreds of years. But let's talk about the daily reality, because power structures are one thing, but daily life tells the real story. Women in medieval America were the backbone of food production. In agricultural societies like the Haudenosaunee, Cherokee, and Pueblo peoples, women developed and controlled farming. They didn't just plant seeds and hope for the best. These women were sophisticated agriculturalists who practiced crop rotation, selective breeding, and companion planting centuries before European agricultural scientists figured out these techniques. The Three Sisters farming technique, used by numerous indigenous groups, is a perfect example. Women planted corn, beans, and squash together in a symbiotic relationship. The corn provided a structure for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, fertilizing the corn and squash. The squash leaves spread across the ground, keeping the soil moist and preventing weeds. This wasn't luck or accident. This was agricultural engineering developed through generations of careful observation, experimentation, and knowledge passed from mother to daughter. And the food security this created? Extraordinary. When European settlers were starving through their first winters, barely surviving, indigenous communities led by women farmers had stores of food that could last years. The Haudenosaunee could feed their entire population through a 3-year famine if necessary, because of the sophisticated storage systems and preservation techniques women had developed. In the Southwest, Pueblo women were master architects. Yes, architects. The massive adobe complexes that housed hundreds of people. Women designed and built those. They mixed the adobe, formed the bricks, and constructed buildings that still stand today, nearly 1,000 years later. Taos Pueblo has been continuously inhabited for over 700 years. These structures weren't thrown together. They were engineered for climate, for defense, for community living, and for longevity. Show me a medieval European peasant home that lasted 700 years. I'll wait. Pueblo women also created pottery that's now considered fine art. But these weren't just pretty decorations. These vessels stored food, carried water, and were essential technology for survival. The pottery was so well made that it could hold water without leaking, withstand fire for cooking, and last for generations. Each design told stories, marked clan affiliation, and passed down cultural knowledge. A single pot could contain the history and identity of an entire family line. Now here's where the humor comes in, because you have to laugh to keep from crying. When European men showed up and saw women doing all this work, farming, building, making decisions, they thought Indigenous men were lazy. They wrote letters back home saying things like, "The savage men lie around while their women do all the work. These poor enslaved women need to be saved from their oppressive husbands." Can you imagine? They saw women with actual power, doing productive work they controlled and owned, and thought they were oppressed. Meanwhile, European women were literally legal property, couldn't own land, couldn't choose their husbands, and could be beaten legally by their fathers or spouses. But sure, Indigenous women needed saving. The irony could kill you. The European men couldn't comprehend that maybe, just maybe, different societies had different divisions of labor that made sense for their environment and culture. In many Indigenous societies, men hunted, which required travel, tracking, and long periods away from home. Women farmed, which required staying close to home where children were. This wasn't oppression. This was a logical division of labor in societies that valued both roles and gave both genders power in their respective spheres. Let me tell you about the economic power women held, because this is another mind-blowing aspect. Among many Plains tribes, women owned the household goods, the teepees, the tools, everything. A successful woman might own multiple teepees, and wealthy women were recognized and respected for their property. If a couple separated, the woman kept all of this. The man left with his weapons, his horse, and his clothes. That's it. Women also controlled trade in many societies. They decided what surplus crops to trade, they negotiated deals, and they built trade relationships with other communities. Archaeological evidence shows extensive trade networks stretching thousands of miles across North America. Shells from the Pacific coast have been found in the Great Lakes region. Copper from Lake Superior was found in the Gulf Coast. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains traveled to the Mississippi River Valley. Women were managing these complex trade relationships, determining exchange rates, and building economic alliances. In the Pacific Northwest, among the Tlingit, Haida, and other coastal peoples, women held and controlled wealth in ways that would make modern investment bankers jealous. They owned coppers, large shield-shaped copper objects that were essentially currency and status symbols. They owned boxes of valuable goods. They controlled the production of chilkat blankets, which took months to weave and were worth fortunes. A high-ranking woman could host a potlatch, a massive ceremonial feast where she'd give away or destroy huge amounts of wealth to demonstrate her status and power. The more she gave away, the more respect and influence she gained. Think about that economic model for a second. Wealth wasn't accumulated and hoarded. It was circulated through the community. And women were at the center of this redistribution system, using economic power to build social relationships and political alliances. This wasn't primitive or backwards. This was a sophisticated understanding that social capital is more valuable than material wealth, and that true power comes from generosity and community respect, not from hoarding resources. Now let's talk about spiritual power, because this is where women's roles get really fascinating. In countless Indigenous American societies, women were spiritual leaders, healers, and keepers of sacred knowledge. They were medicine women, shamans, and ceremonial leaders. They communed with the spirit world, healed the sick, and guided their communities through spiritual crises. Among the Lakota, there were medicine women who could perform healing ceremonies, interpret dreams, and provide spiritual guidance. These women went through years of training, learning the properties of hundreds of plants, the proper prayers and ceremonies, and the spiritual knowledge passed down through generations. When someone was sick, physically or spiritually, the medicine woman was called. Her knowledge could mean the difference between life and death, between a community blessed by the spirits or cursed by them. The respect for these women was profound. A powerful medicine woman was treated with the same reverence as a holy person in any religion. People sought her advice on everything from planting crops to interpreting omens to healing relationship problems. Her word carried weight because her connection to the spiritual realm gave her insight that others didn't have. In Pueblo societies, women were the primary corn grinders, but this wasn't just food preparation. It was a sacred act. Corn was life, and the act of grinding corn was a spiritual practice that connected women to the earth, to the ancestors, and to the divine. The grinding songs women sang weren't just work songs. They were prayers. They were spells. They were links to the sacred. A woman grinding corn was performing a holy ritual that sustained her people on both physical and spiritual levels. Here's another incredible example. Among many California tribes, women were basket weavers, and these baskets were technological marvels. Some baskets were woven so tightly they could hold water. Others were designed to cook food by adding hot stones. The patterns woven into baskets weren't just decorative. They told stories, marked the season, indicated the basket's purpose, and carried spiritual significance. A master basket weaver was an artist, an engineer, and a spiritual practitioner all at once. And the knowledge required? A woman needed to know where to find each type of plant material, when to harvest it, how to prepare it, which materials worked for which purposes, how to create dozens of different weaves and patterns, and the spiritual significance of every design. This knowledge took decades to master and was passed from grandmother to mother to daughter in an unbroken chain stretching back hundreds or thousands of years. If you're enjoying learning about these incredible women and the true history of America that nobody taught us in school, please like this video and subscribe to History Candle YouTube channel. There are so many more untold stories waiting to be discovered, and your support helps bring these hidden histories to light. But we need to talk about something darker now, because it wasn't all enlightenment and equality. Life in medieval America was harsh for everyone, regardless of gender. People died young from diseases, injuries, and childbirth complications. Winters could be brutal. Droughts could cause famine. Warfare between tribes could be devastating. Women suffered unique dangers. Childbirth was risky without modern medicine. A difficult birth could kill both mother and child. Even successful births were followed by infections, hemorrhaging, and complications that could be fatal. Many women died young after multiple pregnancies. The archaeological record shows women's skeletons with stress markers from repeated childbirth, hard physical labor, and nutritional deficiencies from feeding everyone else first during hard times. Women could also be captured in warfare. When rival tribes fought, women and children were sometimes taken as captives. Depending on the tribe and circumstances, captured women might be adopted into the capturing tribe, married to warriors, kept as slaves, or killed. The experience was traumatic, and the fate uncertain. Some captured women eventually integrated into their new communities and rose to positions of respect. Others remained in subordinate positions for life. It varied enormously by culture, circumstance, and individual. Violence against women existed too. Despite the power women held in many Indigenous societies, they weren't immune to domestic violence, assault, or abuse. Different tribes had different ways of handling these crimes. Some societies had harsh punishments for men who hurt women. Others left it to families to seek justice or revenge. The idea that all indigenous societies were utopias of gender equality is simply not true. They were human societies with all the complexity, variation, and problems that implies. But here's what's important to understand. Even with these harsh realities, even with the dangers and difficulties, women in most medieval American societies had legal rights, property rights, and social respect that European women wouldn't achieve until the 1800s or later. That's not romanticizing. That's documented fact. Let me give you a specific comparison that drives this home. A Haudenosaunee woman in the year 1400 could own property, divorce her husband, control her children, participate in government, and couldn't be legally beaten by her husband. An English woman in the year 1400 was legally her husband's property, couldn't own land. Her children belonged to her husband. She had no political voice, and her husband could legally beat her as long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb. That's where the phrase rule of thumb comes from, by the way. That's the comparison. Two women, same time period, drastically different rights and realities. Now let's talk about diversity, because medieval America wasn't a monolith. Different regions, different tribes, different cultures meant vastly different roles for women. What was true for the Haudenosaunee wasn't necessarily true for the Pueblo people, the Plains tribes, the Pacific Northwest cultures, or the Southeastern societies. In some Great Plains tribes, women had less formal political power than in the Iroquois Confederacy, but they had tremendous economic power. Among the Cheyenne, women owned the teepees, the household goods, and controlled the distribution of food. A man might be a great warrior, but his wife decided when to move camp, what to pack, and how to allocate resources. A respected woman's opinion on where to camp, when to move, and how to prepare for winter carried enormous weight. Plains women also formed powerful guilds, almost like medieval European guilds, but run by and for women. The Cheyenne had the Quillwork Society, where women who excelled at decorating with porcupine quills came together. This wasn't just a social club. Membership in this society brought prestige, economic opportunity, and social influence. These women collaborated on major projects, taught younger women, maintained quality standards, and collectively held significant power in their communities. In the Pacific Northwest, women's status was often tied to their clan and family lineage. A woman born into a high-ranking family held power from birth. She might own property, control resources, and wield influence over marriages, alliances, and trade relationships. But a woman born into a lower-ranking family, or worse, into slavery, had very little power or freedom. Northwest coast societies were highly stratified with nobles, commoners, and slaves. A woman's gender mattered, but her social class mattered more. The Natchez people of the Southeast had a hereditary ruling class called the Sons, and guess what? Noble women could hold as much power as noble men. The Great Son, the supreme leader, was often a man, but female sons held authority over commoners, owned land, and participated in decision-making. Lineage passed through women, meaning a child's status came from their mother, not their father. A female son who married a commoner had children who were noble. A male son who married a commoner also had noble children, but it was the mother's status that determined clan affiliation. Among the Mississippian cultures, which built massive earthen mounds and complex chiefdoms, women's roles varied by social status and individual chiefdom. Some archaeological evidence suggests female chiefs or very powerful elite women. The famous Etowah mounds in Georgia have burial sites of high-status women buried with elaborate grave goods, suggesting they held significant power in life. Other evidence shows women as primary craft producers, creating the shell beads, copper ornaments, and woven goods that were essential to the trade economy. In the Southwest, Puebloan cultures were generally matrilineal and matrilical, meaning women owned homes and men moved to their wives' houses upon marriage. But Apache and Navajo cultures, which also lived in the Southwest, had different systems. Navajo women owned livestock, especially sheep, and sheep meant wealth. A woman with a large flock was wealthy and respected. She could arrange marriages for her children from a position of strength, and she controlled the family's economic foundation. The Apache had different bands with different customs, but women generally had respected roles as food producers, hide workers, and household managers. Apache women were also known for their fierce defense of their families. More than one Apache woman fought alongside men to defend their communities from enemies. The warrior woman Lozin, who lived later but represented a long tradition, was a respected fighter, strategist, and spiritual leader. Stories tell of women from earlier centuries who showed similar courage and capability. In California, the incredible diversity of tribes meant incredible diversity in women's roles. Some tribes were matrilineal, others patrilineal. Some gave women significant political voice, others less so. But across California cultures, women were expert botanists. California offered incredible plant diversity, and women knew every edible plant, every medicinal herb, every fiber plant, and every plant's properties. This knowledge was encyclopedic and essential for survival. A Chumash woman might know the uses of 200 different plants. A Pomo woman's basket weaving knowledge represented generations of botanical and engineering expertise. Eastern woodland tribes, including the Algonquian peoples, varied in how much formal power women held, but women's economic contributions were always essential. Women's farming fed the communities. Women's gatherings supplemented diets with nuts, berries, roots, and greens. Women processed animal hides into clothing and shelter. Without women's labor, communities simply couldn't survive. What's the common thread through all this diversity? Women's work was valued. It wasn't considered lesser or secondary. It was recognized as essential. And in most cases, women retained control over the products of their labor. A woman who grew corn owned that corn. A woman who made a basket owned that basket. A woman who produced children retained primary authority over those children. These weren't universal rules, but they were common patterns that stood in stark contrast to European norms, where men legally owned everything their wives produced, including children. Now, here's a question for you. Knowing that Indigenous women in medieval America often had more rights, more power, and more respect than European women of the same era, why do you think this history has been buried and ignored for so long? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is a conversation we need to be having. Let's talk about what happened when Europeans arrived, because that's when everything changed, and not for the better. When European colonizers showed up, they brought their own ideas about gender, and those ideas were toxic by Indigenous standards. European men couldn't understand or accept societies where women held power. It offended their religious beliefs, their social norms, and their sense of proper order. Colonial governments and missionaries actively worked to destroy Indigenous women's power. They insisted that only men could own property. They demanded that European-style marriage, where women obeyed husbands, replace Indigenous marriage customs. They removed children from mothers and sent them to boarding schools to erase their culture. They criminalized Indigenous religions, cutting women off from their roles as spiritual leaders and healers. The impact was devastating. Haudenosaunee Clan Mothers lost legal authority under colonial law. Cherokee Beloved Women found their voices ignored when treaties were negotiated with white men only. Pueblo women's property rights were eroded under Spanish and later Mexican and American law. Across the continent, women who had held power for centuries found themselves shoved into European gender roles that didn't fit their cultures or their histories. Economic changes hurt women too. When fur trading became dominant in many areas, men's hunting and trapping became more economically valuable than women's agriculture or craft production. When the U.S. government forced tribes onto reservations and tried to turn them into European-style farmers, they taught farming to men and ignored or suppressed women's agricultural expertise. The economic foundation of women's power was deliberately destroyed. The introduction of European diseases killed millions of indigenous people, and women suffered particularly high death rates during childbearing years. This demographic catastrophe disrupted the transmission of knowledge from older women to younger generations. Imagine a society where grandmothers taught granddaughters everything they needed to know, and then a plague kills half the grandmothers. That knowledge, those skills, those traditions, they die too. The cultural genocide of colonization wasn't just about laws and policies. It was about breaking the chains of knowledge that connected women across generations. But here's what the colonizers never understood. You can't kill knowledge that lives in people's hearts and minds. You can suppress it, discourage it, criminalize it, but you can't kill it entirely. Indigenous women never completely lost their traditions, their power, or their identity. They protected what they could, adapted what they had to, and waited for chances to reclaim what was taken. Today, Indigenous women are leading revitalization efforts. They're reclaiming languages, teaching traditional crafts, reviving agricultural practices, and asserting political power. They're running for tribal council, serving as chiefs and chairwomen, and fighting for sovereignty and treaty rights. They're medicine women and spiritual leaders reconnecting their communities with sacred practices. They're artists and teachers, making sure the next generation knows where they came from. Women like Wilma Mankiller, who became the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, embody this resilience. She led her nation from a position that Cherokee women had held power in for centuries, reconnecting modern Cherokee governance with ancient traditions of female leadership. Her work in improving education, healthcare, and economic development for her people continued the legacy of Cherokee Beloved Women, who always put their community's welfare first. Winona LaDuke, an Anishinaabe activist and environmentalist, has spent decades fighting for environmental justice and indigenous rights, continuing the tradition of women as protectors of the land and resources. Her work recognizes what indigenous women have always known. You can't separate environmental health from community health, and protecting the earth is protecting your children and grandchildren. The Native women leading movements like Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, MMIW, are standing in a long tradition of women protecting their communities. They're demanding justice, visibility, and action on issues that affect Indigenous women at horrifying rates. They're modern warriors fighting a different kind of battle, but with the same fierce determination as the war women and beloved women of centuries past. So what's the final takeaway here? What should you remember from all this? Women in medieval America weren't waiting around to be liberated by Europeans. They didn't need saving. They had complex, sophisticated societies where they held power, owned property, controlled economic resources, led spiritually, and shaped the futures of their nations. They were architects, farmers, diplomats, spiritual leaders, artists, and decision-makers. The story we've been told about civilization Progress and women's rights is incomplete at best and deliberately false at worst. Women's liberation isn't a modern Western invention gifted to the world by European Enlightenment. It's something that existed in many forms across human societies, including right here in medieval America, long before Europeans decided they'd invented the concept. When we erase this history, we do several harmful things at once. We disrespect Indigenous peoples by ignoring their actual histories and imposing false narratives. We rob modern women of knowledge about alternative ways societies can organize gender roles. We perpetuate the myth that patriarchal European structures are natural or inevitable. And we forget that for hundreds of years on this continent, different possibilities existed. The women who farmed the Three Sisters, who built pueblos that still stand today, who selected and removed chiefs, who held councils, who performed healing ceremonies, who wove baskets so fine they could hold water, who negotiated peace treaties, who controlled trade networks, who protected sacred knowledge, and who raised generation after generation of strong children while maintaining sophisticated civilizations. These women deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told. Their power deserves to be recognized. This isn't about saying everything was perfect in medieval America. It wasn't. Life was hard, violent, short, and brutal in many ways for both men and women. Different tribes had different levels of gender equality, and some Indigenous societies were more patriarchal than others. There's no noble savage myth here, no romantic fantasy. These were real people living in real societies with real flaws. But those flaws don't erase the truth. Indigenous women in medieval America generally had rights, respect, and power that European women couldn't imagine. And when Europeans arrived and destroyed these societies, Indigenous women lost something precious. They lost power structures that had served them and their communities for generations. They were forced into foreign gender roles that didn't fit their traditions or their identities. They were told that their ways were savage, primitive, and wrong, when in fact their ways were often more equitable and just than what replaced them. The legacy of these women lives on. It lives in their descendants who still farm, weave, heal, teach, and lead. It lives in the clan mothers who still serve in Haudenosaunee government. It lives in the Pueblo women who still own their homes and tend their fields. It lives in the basket weavers, the bead workers, the language teachers, the activists, and the leaders who refuse to let their cultures die. It also lives in the influence Indigenous societies had on American democracy. The Founding Fathers, including Benjamin Franklin, were aware of and impressed by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Some historians argue that Indigenous governance models influenced American democratic ideals. If that's true, then Indigenous women's political power indirectly shaped the government we have today, even though most Americans have never heard of clan mothers or beloved women. Understanding this history changes how we view women's rights, Indigenous sovereignty, and American history itself. It challenges us to question whose stories get told and whose get erased. It reminds us that progress isn't linear, that civilizations rise and fall, and that people in the past weren't necessarily less sophisticated or enlightened than we are. Sometimes they knew things we've forgotten. Sometimes they built societies we should study rather than dismiss. So the next time someone tells you that women's liberation is a modern Western achievement, you can tell them about the Haudenosaunee Clan Mothers who removed chiefs from power. Tell them about the Cherokee Beloved Women who negotiated with nations. Tell them about the Pueblo women who owned land and homes for centuries. Tell them about the Plains women who owned teepees and trade goods. Tell them about the Pacific Northwest women who hosted potlatches and controlled wealth. Tell them about the medicine women, the basket weavers, the farmers, and the spiritual leaders who shaped medieval America in ways that history has tried to erase. These women existed. They mattered. They held power in ways both subtle and overt. They built civilizations, fed nations, raised leaders, protected traditions, and created beauty that still inspires us today. They deserve to be remembered not as footnotes or exceptions, but as the powerful, capable, essential members of their societies that they were. If you've learned something today, if this video has opened your eyes to a history you never knew, please like this video and subscribe to History Candle YouTube channel. Share this knowledge with others. Talk about these incredible women. Ask why you weren't taught this in school. Demand that Indigenous voices be centered in telling Indigenous history. Support Indigenous communities today who are still fighting for sovereignty, justice, and recognition. The story of women in medieval America isn't just Indigenous history. It's American history. It's human history. It's a story about different possibilities, about societies organized in different ways, about power structures we've lost and could perhaps learn from. It's about recognizing that civilization doesn't have one definition. Progress doesn't follow one path, and women have been powerful, capable leaders throughout human history when societies chose to recognize and respect them. Remember these women, honor their legacy, learn their stories, and recognize that the land you stand on was shaped by their hands, fed by their labor, protected by their wisdom, and blessed by their prayers long before the first European ever set foot on these shores. They were here. They mattered. They still matter. And their daughters and granddaughters are still here, still leading, still protecting, still teaching, and still demanding the respect their ancestors earned. This is history they didn't want you to know. Now you know it. What you do with that knowledge is up to you.